79 years are not a mystery. They are a delay. The file on Lieutenant Robert M. King never disappeared. It lay in a filing cabinet, numbered, stamped, opened multiple times, and closed again. The machine he flew, a B-24J Liberator, with serial number 42-1-00184, was definitively located in the year 2010. The crash site was known. The responsibility as well. What was missing was not knowledge, but action. Today, this case is often described as long unsolved. That is not accurate. It was long unfinished. On a forested mountain ridge in northeastern India, more than 11,000 feet above sea level, aluminum fragments have lain in the ground since the spring of 1944. They rust slowly in the humid climate. Bamboo grows through bent ribs. An engine housing lies sideways, half sunk into the earth. The position was documented, photographed, mapped. And yet the site remained untouched. Lieutenant King disappeared on a routine flight route over the so-called Hump, the airlift between India and China. His last radio message was brief, factual, 30 minutes east of Chibua. After that, nothing more. A year later, the military officially declared him and the other men on board dead. There was no recovery, no grave, only a name on a wall. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Commons, his wife, waited. She kept letters, thin envelopes, written in pencil. She did not refold them. She knew where they lay. That was enough. Decades passed. The war ended. Files were archived. Responsibilities changed. The crash site remained the same. In the year 2010, Clayton Cools, a private researcher without government assignment, reached the slope. He found wreckage, serial numbers, personal items, human remains. The case was thus no longer open. It was proven. And yet 13 more years followed without official recovery. This story is not about uncertainty. It is about postponed duty. About a promise no one will be left behind that was not broken, but repeatedly deferred. And about people who remained their entire lives without a place of farewell. The mountain stood there the whole time. The file as well. Before his name was engraved on metal, before file numbers and casualty reports captured him, Robert M. King was a young man with habits, with small decisions, with a body that grew accustomed to early rising, and hands that preferred to work rather than remain idle. He was in his early 20s when he learned to fly. Not from a thirst for adventure, as was later often told, but from a sober consideration. Flying was a craft that was needed, and he was good at it. But bypaper.com. His training records show no dramatic comments, clean lines, even handwriting, evaluations like calm under pressure and observes procedures. That was what distinguished him. In Kansas, where he grew up, the weather was open and predictable. Wind came visibly across the plains. Rain could be smelled before it fell. Robert learned early to read the sky, without needing many words for it. Later, in training, this became discipline. Checklists, repetitions, procedures. He went through them quietly, even when no one was watching. Elizabeth Commons met him before the uniform determined his life. She later remembered less the grand gestures than the small things. How he turned the pencil when writing to preserve the tip. How he read letters twice before sealing them. Not because he was uncertain, she once said, but because he didn't want to say anything unnecessary. The letters from this time are short. No promises of heroism. No future visions full of pathos. Instead, sentences like, "The machines are loud but reliable," or, "I'm learning a lot. It's exhausting, but meaningful." He wrote regularly, almost ritually. Sundays, when possible. Same time. Same place, in the barracks. His plan for after the war was unspectacular. Return home. Work as a civilian. Maybe theater again. Maybe something else. He didn't speak about it often, but he thought about it. A life without deployment schedules. Without maps with red lines. Elizabeth knew this. It wasn't a promise, more a tacit agreement. His greatest concrete concern was not the enemy. It was the weather. Already in training, he had respect for cloud fronts, for icing, for poor visibility. He noted remarks about wind conditions. Asked instructors about borderline cases. Not from fear, but from caution. "The sky forgives no carelessness," he once said casually, while hanging up his flight suit. The everyday life before deployment consisted of repetition. Wake up, Fall in, fly, wait, write. Elizabeth adapted to this rhythm. She filed letters in a drawer, neatly, chronologically. She answered each one, even if it was only a few lines, even if she had nothing new to report. The writing itself became the action that connected. In one of the last letters before his transfer, Robert mentioned a machine he liked. "She's cumbersome, but honest," he wrote. "If you treat her right, she brings you back." It was no premonition, just a description from the daily life of a pilot who knew that technology has limits. He wore his uniform as if it were work clothes, clean but worn. The seams at the elbows were soft from much bending. Elizabeth noticed this when she saw him for the last time. She said nothing. Neither did he. Some things needed no words. The farewell was brief, no embrace that lasted longer than usual, no sentence that could have been meant as the last. "I'll write as soon as I can," he said. She nodded. That was their arrangement. When he left, the room remained unchanged. His chair still stood at an angle to the table. A notepad lay open, one page half written. Elizabeth left everything as it was, not from sentimentality, but because it felt right. The war was an interruption, not a replacement for the life before. No one in this moment thought of mountains in Asia, of borders that would later be disputed, of files that would have to be reopened decades later. There was only the next letter, the next flight, the quiet belief that routines carry. And so, the time of waiting began not with a bang, but with a completely normal day that looked just like many before it. The war came into Robert's life not with sirens or explosions, but with paper, with a new assignment, cleanly typed, with a place name he had previously only seen on maps. The daily routine remained outwardly the same: fall in, weather briefing, aircraft takeover, but everything now took place in an environment that tolerated no error. The China-Burma-India theater was not a battlefield in the conventional sense. There were no continuous front lines, no clear retreat areas. Instead, there were distances that were barely comprehensible, heights that challenged even experienced pilots, weather that changed faster than it could be calculated. The men simply called the route over the Himalayas the Hump, not an official name, more a shrug in word form, something that had to be endured, flight by flight. The Liberator that Robert flew carried the identification 4200-184. It was not a new aircraft. The machine had accumulated hours, had seen stress. Its aluminum skin had become dull, where sun and rain had marked it. The four engines ran reliably, as long as one understood them. Robert knew their sounds. He heard nuances long before instruments reacted. He trusted them, but never blindly. The crew was not a community born of friendship, but of necessity. 10 men, brought together by deployment schedules. They knew each other well enough to maintain procedures, but not well enough for closeness. Closeness made one vulnerable. And vulnerability was dangerous when one knew how many machines did not return. John Byron, the co-pilot, sat on the right. Taller than Robert, quieter in movement. He spoke little during flight. When he said something, then soberly, RPM, course, time. Robert let him calculate. Byron let Robert decide. Words were rarely necessary. Navigator Eugene Bernstein lived in numbers and assumptions. The maps he worked with were incomplete. Entire mountain ranges were only suggested. Often, where details should have been, there was a single word: uncharted. Bernstein calculated with courses, times, wind values. He sometimes raised his head, looked out the side window, searched for river courses or ridges. Often he saw nothing but gray. In the radio room sat John Regan, headphones on his ears, shoulders slightly pulled forward. He wrote, listened, waited. Radio over the mountains was unreliable. Signals broke off, distorted. Minutes could pass without response. Regan remained calm. That was his job. Flight engineer Robert Riley moved between instruments and engines. He smelled oil before it became problematic. He knew the temperatures, knew when an engine was reaching its limit. On these flights, he was constantly busy. The Liberator was heavily loaded. Fuel was not just cargo, it was danger. On the 25th of May, 1944, the day began early. Yankai lay in haze. The ground was damp, the air heavy. Mechanics worked silently, focused. It was not a combat mission. It was a ferry flight to Chibua in India. Such flights were considered routine, but no one treated them lightly. Robert went through the checklist, as always. Fingers over switches, eyes on instruments. A brief exchange with Byron. No jokes. Bernstein reported the calculated course. Riley confirmed the values. Regan checked the radio. Every action had its place. The weather briefing was brief. Cloud cover. Possibility of icing. Strong winds in the valleys. None of this was extraordinary. May marked the transition to monsoon season. Clouds could pile up within minutes. Visibility could disappear without warning. The takeoff proceeded normally. The Liberator lifted heavily, slowly gained altitude. Below them, the terrain passed by green, rugged. Rivers flashed briefly through cloud gaps. Then the sky closed. At cruising altitude it became cold. The cabin was drafty. Breath became visible. The men moved routinely, each in his area. Time stretched. Flying over the hump was monotonous tension. Nothing happened until something happened. The wind came stronger than expected. Bernstein corrected the course. Byron kept the machine steady. Robert observed the clouds ahead of them. Gray towers, stacked on top of each other. One evaded, climbed, descended, sought calmer air. That's how one had learned it. At some point, Regan reported radio contact. He transmitted the position report, factually formulated. 30 minutes east of Chibua. No warning, no addition. It was a routine statement. It was the last confirmed message. What happened after that could never be fully reconstructed. There was no further radio call, no distress signal, no sighting report from other machines. Only the absence. When the Liberator did not land in Chibua, it was initially listed as delayed. That was common. Machines often arrived late. Weather forced detours. Fuel calculations were tight, but not hopeless. Hours passed. Only later was the flight reported as overdue. Search flights started as far as conditions allowed. Other machines searched the route, flew along valleys, over cloud decks, at dangerous altitudes. Visibility was poor. Rain set in. Clouds hung low. Search flights over the hump were risky. Each additional machine increased the danger of further losses. After a few days without result, efforts were reduced. Reports were written. Coordinates estimated. Possibilities weighed. The official formulation was sober. Missing. Presumably crashed. Location inaccessible. For the men who had flown with Robert, there was no farewell. They simply had not returned. Beds remained empty. Personal items lay where they had been left. Comrades waited a few days. Then new names were entered into deployment schedules. In Chibua, an officer noted the absence in a logbook. One line, one date, one identification. He closed the book and turned to the next item. The war left little room for lingering. Elizabeth received the news of the absence weeks later. The telegram was factual. No details, no explanation. Only the indication that Robert's machine had not returned and that a search was underway. She read the text several times, laid it on the table, picked it up again. She wrote a letter, even though she knew he would not read it. It was a habit, an action against the nothingness. She wrote about the weather, about small repairs to the house. She did not mention her fear. She set the letter aside. A year later came the next communication. Declared dead. An administrative decision, necessary for files and responsibilities. For Elizabeth, it was not an end, it was a shift. From waiting for news to waiting without prospect. The war continued. Other machines started. Other crews disappeared. The hump remained. Aluminum fragments collected in places no one saw. Maps were updated, but not made more precise. Responsibility was passed on. The question was not what had happened to the machine. Everyone who flew there knew the possibilities. Weather, icing, course deviation, terrain. The real question was quieter. Who would take care when the war was over? This question had no addressee yet. It remained unspoken. Elizabeth asked it of herself at night when she could not sleep. She asked it of no one. The hump took machines without sound. It left only gaps. And so from a flight that was considered routine became a date that stood still. A 25th of May that no longer moved. The war regulated the loss. It did not regulate the aftermath. The silence was not an oversight. It was part of the system. And somewhere between clouds and mountain ridges, Beyond any clear line, a flight ended without anyone listening. What followed the disappearance of Robert M. King was not a single moment, but a sequence of small, precise actions. None of them was spectacular. None of them was meant cruelly. But together they created something lasting, a state from which no one felt responsible to break out. In the first days after the 25th of May, 1944, the military machinery worked as it had learned. The flight had not arrived. That was registered, not as a catastrophe, but as a deviation. Deviations were checked, not mourned. An officer in Shibuya sat over a list of expected returnees. Names, identifications, times. Next to the entry for King's machine, a field remained empty. He waited. He checked the clock. He waited further. Then he made a mark, small and inconspicuous. No red sign, no exclamation point. Only a note that said, "Still open." This phase had rules. How long one waited, when one inquired, when one reported. None of this was improvised. The war had ensured that such procedures were standardized. Too many machines failed to arrive for a new reaction each time. In the next hours, other crews were asked if they had seen or heard anything. The answers were uniform. Poor visibility, clouds, no radio contact. No one remembered anything conspicuous. That was not suspicious. It was normal. Only with the onset of night did the tone change. A report was drafted. Not long. No narrative text. Only facts. Departure point, destination, last known message. Weather conditions. Time of overdue status. The report was forwarded. Not to a single person, but to a chain of offices. The following morning, search measures began. Not extensive, not long-lasting. Conditions barely allowed it. Clouds hung low. Rain set in. Valleys were closed. Pilots flew known routes, looked for smoke, for unusual light reflections. They knew how slim the chances were. These search flights were part of duty. Nothing more, nothing less. Everyone knew that one could not search long. Each additional flight meant risk, and risk was a resource that was already overstretched. After a few days without result, the language of reports changed. From search ongoing became search without findings. From further measures planned became further measures currently not possible. This shift was subtle but final. The file grew by a few pages. Weather maps, radio protocols, assessments. No hypotheses that could be held. No clues that would have enabled a targeted recovery. The terrain was described as difficult, later as inaccessible. A year after the disappearance followed the formal step that was provided for in such cases. The men on board were declared dead, not because it was known what had happened, but because the law demanded an endpoint. A state of being missing could not exist indefinitely. This document was factual. It contained no location, no date of death, only a determination. For the administration, it meant clarity. For the relatives, it meant something else. Elizabeth Commons received the notification on a day that did not outwardly differ. The envelope bore an official seal. She recognized it immediately. She opened it slowly, sat down, read the text. She read it a second time to make sure she had not overlooked anything. There was nothing to overlook. She placed the letter with the other papers, not neatly sorted, but by proximity. Robert's letters lay on top. Below them, the telegrams. Below that, now this document. It had no weight, and yet it pressed. In the weeks after, she noticed that something changed. Not in herself first, but in the attitude of the people around her. Before, people had cautiously asked if there was news. Now no one asked anymore. The official status had replaced the waiting. Elizabeth adapted. She did not speak about it unless asked directly. Then she answered briefly. She used the same words as the document. Declared dead. It was easier than seeking her own formulations. What was missing was a place. Without a grave, there was no occasion for visits, no fixed days, no ritual. The loss remained abstract. It was present, but not tangible. Elizabeth found that other people dealt better with absence, when it had a place. She lacked this place. In military archives, the case was now considered closed. Not solved, but administratively ended. The file was not destroyed, but it moved. From an active register to a passive one. from a desk to an archive. With this movement, responsibility also changed. As long as a case was open, there were contact persons. Once it was closed, there were only referrals. Responsibilities became unclear. Whoever was asked referred further. Elizabeth wrote nonetheless. In the first years after the declaration, she sent brief letters to offices whose names she knew from earlier responses. She did not ask about guilt. She asked if there were plans, if it was known where exactly the machine had gone down. The answers came: polite, correct, non-committal. Currently, there are no new findings. The terrain is considered difficult to access. A recovery is not planned according to current status. These sentences repeated themselves. They became a kind of echo. Elizabeth filed the letters. She threw none away. Not because she believed she would need them later, but because throwing them away would have felt wrong. Over the years, the institutional language changed further. In early responses, there had still been mention of efforts. Later, no more. The case was now part of a statistic. A number in an overview. Not unique, but one of many. This classification had consequences. An individual case could raise questions. A number could not. Numbers demanded no explanation. Elizabeth also noticed that she herself began to change her expectations. Not consciously, but gradually. She stopped hoping for certain words, for search, for plan, for appointment. She no longer counted on something happening. But she also did not stop feeling the lack. The immediate post-war period brought new topics: reconstruction, new conflicts, other losses. In this environment, her husband's case seemed old. It belonged to another time. That did not make it less painful, but easier to overlook. What remained was a kind of institutional quiet, not peace, but standstill. No one contradicted the decision to do nothing further. No one actively advocated to change it. The case was not controversial. It was finished. But this finishing had its price. It shifted responsibility from the present to the past. It made an open obligation into a historical footnote. Elizabeth lived on. She worked. She moved. She ordered her life so that it functioned. But she made decisions carefully. She rarely planned long-term. Not from hopelessness, but from experience. Things could remain open at any time. Sometimes, she took one of Robert's letters in hand, not to read it, but to feel the paper. Thin, light, fragile. She thought then not of the crash. She thought of the aftermath, of the years without movement. The immediate consequences of the disappearance were thus not chaos or storms of grief. They were order, administration, closure, and precisely this order made it so difficult to begin again later, because what was once closed had to be reopened first. And for that, something was needed that no one had at this time. Time, access, and the will to question old decisions. So this phase ended not with an event, but with a state that persisted, and that settled deeper year by year. The case of Robert M. King did not move for decades, not because no one knew it, but because no one felt responsible for it. It lay where closed files lie, reachable but untouched. The change began not in a ministry, but with a single man who refused to accept the word finished. Clayton Coolidge was not an officer and not a diplomat. He wore no uniform, had no mandate. What he had was time, persistence, and a growing knowledge of the mountains that others avoided. In the years when official offices viewed the Hump as a closed chapter, Coolidge learned how to ask questions without expecting answers, and how to continue nonetheless. His entry into this work was not strategically planned. It began with interest, became habit, and finally obligation. Coolidge read reports, compared maps, spoke with families. He heard the same sentences over and over. Not recoverable, inaccessible, politically difficult. He did not accept them as endpoints, but as descriptions of a problem. Unlike government agencies, Coolidge had to weigh nothing except his own risk. He could decide to go, and he did. With backpacks, with simple maps, with information that often came second-hand or third-hand. He knew that much of it was unreliable, but he also knew that none of it was worse than standstill. The clues to King's Liberator came not from archives, but from people on the ground, hunters, wood-gatherers, men who moved in the mountains without having to name them. They spoke of metal in the forest, of old parts that no one could use, of things that had been there before they themselves were born. Kulis listened. He took notes. He asked no big questions. He asked about paths, about distances, about rainy seasons. He learned that orientation functioned differently there, not in degrees and coordinates, but in day marches, river crossings, and distinctive trees. In late autumn of the year 2010, he set out. The region was remote, difficult to access, politically sensitive. Permits were vague. Much ran on tacit toleration. Kulis traveled with local guides who reluctantly saw their names in records. One of them was named Tashi. He spoke little English, but he knew the path. The ascent was slow. The ground was wet, slippery. Bamboo cut into the skin. Leeches were omnipresent. At night it became cold. In the mornings fog crept through the trees. Each step demanded attention. Kulis noted elevations, not from accuracy, but to understand his own progress. On one of the days, Tashi stopped and pointed upslope. Old, he said, nothing more. They climbed further. Then Kulis saw something that stood out from the surroundings. A line, too straight for nature. Aluminum, dull, covered with moss. He stopped, laid his hand on it. The metal was cold, even though the air was humid. They found more. Bent ribs, part of an engine housing. Struts that had once been structure. Everything distributed over a long slope. No single point of impact. That spoke of an impact with speed, of breaking apart upon hitting. Kulis moved carefully. He knew that this place was not a find, but a grave. He spoke quietly with the guides. "We touch nothing," he said. Tashi nodded. One respected such places. Then Kulis found something that ended doubts. A serial number, still readable, not complete, but sufficient. He compared it with his documents. It matched. It was King's Liberator. Nearby lay personal items, small, inconspicuous, part of equipment, fabric remnants. Indications that no one had jumped. Kulis took photos. He marked positions. He wrote everything down. He knew that every detail would count later. The find changed the status of the case. Not officially, but factually. The location was now known, documented, proven. There was no longer any doubt about the identity of the machine. And there were indications of human remains. Kulis left the mountain with the knowledge that he had done something that no one had done for a long time. He had looked. But he also knew that seeing alone would not be enough. The real work was only now beginning. He submitted his documents to offices whose names had changed over the years. He sent reports, photos, coordinates. The responses were reserved. They thanked him. They confirmed receipt. They explained that private finds would have to be verified. Here began a new form of waiting. No longer in the unclear, but in knowledge. The location was known. The evidence was present. And yet nothing happened. Years passed, 13 in number. The reasons were not technical in nature. They lay outside the mountain. The area in which the machine lay was politically delicate. Border questions, responsibilities, diplomatic considerations. Every official movement could have sent signals, and signals were undesirable. So everything remained lying. Kulis became a mediator between two worlds. He spoke with families who now knew where their relatives lay. He spoke with authorities who could promise nothing. He bore the tension that resulted from this. Once he said to a colleague, "It's not an unsolved case. It's an abandoned one." The sentence stuck. It described exactly what had happened. For Elizabeth Commons, the news came late. She learned that the location had been found, not through an official communication, but through a letter. She read it slowly. The thought that Robert had a place changed something. Not the loss, but the form. So he was there, she said quietly to no one. It was not comfort, it was statement. The years after the discovery were marked by repetitions. New inquiries, new conversations, new delays. The justifications varied. The effect remained the same. The case remained unprocessed. Kulis returned several times to the region, not always to the same place. He documented other wrecks, other stories. He did it because he knew that attention created pressure, not immediately, but long-term. In doing so, he risked much. Not only physically, he moved in gray areas. He had to gain trust without being able to give guarantees. He had to promise without being sure that promises would be kept. The local population observed him with skepticism, but also with respect. He did not come to take something away. He came to record. That made a difference. The reopening of the case was thus not an act of a state, but the result of persistent individual work. It showed what was possible, and at the same time where the limits lay. Knowledge could be produced, movement could not. At the end of this phase stood no conclusion. It stood a new tension. The location was known. The responsibility lay open. And the question was no longer whether one could act, but when one would finally do so. The mountain remained where it was, the evidence as well. And somewhere between documentation and diplomacy began the next delay, harder to justify than all before. The actual recovery began not with an assent, but with a tacit decision that there was no further justification for inaction. The location had been known for years. The evidence was present. The time windows were narrow, but available. What was missing was not information, but the will not to postpone responsibility any longer. When this will finally formed, it was not publicly announced. It did not appear in speeches or press releases. It showed itself in emails whose tone was more cautious than usual, in permits that were not withdrawn, in appointments that were not postponed again. To outsiders, it seemed inconspicuous. For those who had waited for years, it was a break with the past. For Clayton Coolidge, this moment did not feel like a breakthrough. He had experienced too long how commitments ended in nothing. The news that an official recovery was actually being prepared triggered in him not relief, but a sober question. How long does this window remain open? It was not mistrust that drove this question. It was something deeper, a weariness that had arisen from too many disappointed hopes. Coolidge had learned that promises in this context were meaningless as long as they were not translated into actions. And even then, they remained fragile. He expected nothing more, not from resignation, but from self-protection. Whoever had hoped too often eventually lost the ability to do so. What remained was a cool vigilance, the readiness to act as soon as the window opened, paired with the knowledge that it could close again at any time. The conditions were narrowly defined. Access, yes, but only in a limited time period. Movement, yes, but only along established routes. Documentation, yes, but exclusively according to state protocols. No one formulated these specifications as restrictions. They were presented as necessary prerequisites, and everyone knew that exceeding these prerequisites could bring everything to a standstill again. Arunachal Pradesh remained a politically sensitive space. The slope on which the liberator lay was not just a geographical place, but a symbol. Every official activity could be read as a statement. Therefore, the recovery had to be designed so that it made no statement neither territorial nor political. It could only be one thing: a humanitarian duty. The route to the crash site was chosen accordingly, not the shortest, not the easiest, but the one that generated the least attention. That meant additional days in the field, additional elevation gain, additional burden. No one complained about it. Everyone knew why it was so. This forced caution carried its own emotional burden. The team moved not only through difficult terrain, but through a field of political sensitivities that was equally dangerous. Every step had to be calculated. Every decision had to remain defensible. It was the tension of people who knew that they were responsible for more than just their own mission, that an error would not only affect them, but make all future attempts impossible. This responsibility sat like a second burden on their shoulders. Invisible but constantly felt, the group consisted of members of the Defense POW, MIA accounting agency, supplemented by a few civilian specialists. Coolidge was part of it, but not in an official capacity. He knew that his role had changed. He was no longer the discoverer. He was a witness to what must now follow. In this shift lay a quiet humility. Coolidge had spent years documenting this find, proving it, defending it. He could have been justified in seeing himself as a central figure. Instead, he stepped back, not from weakness, but from the understanding that his work must now pass into other hands. It was the gesture of a man who had learned that ego had no place in a mission that was larger than any individual person. Local guides accompanied the group. Without them, no movement would have been possible. One of them was Tashi, a man who did not explain the mountain but read it. His knowledge could not be transferred to maps. It lay in decisions made at the right moment. On the first evening in the provisional camp, Tashi sat apart and observed the group. Finally, he said quietly, "The mountain listens. It notices whether you come to respect or to take." No one answered immediately. The words were not a warning. They were a statement. For Tashi, this was no metaphor. The mountain was for him a presence that reacted to intentions. The team listened, not because they shared his worldview, but because they recognized that his knowledge guaranteed their survival. In this moment occurred a quiet reversal of hierarchy. All their technology, all their official authority, meant nothing without what Tashi brought, an understanding of the mountain that had developed over generations. The team showed him respect, not from duty, but from necessity. And in this necessity lay a lesson in humility. The team worked with discipline. Everyone knew what task they had. There were no discussions about procedures. Not because doubts were absent, but because they had already been clarified in advance. Everything that happened here had to be comprehensible later. Every movement, every extraction, every decision. The team leader spoke little. His instructions were precise. When he turned to Kulis, he only said, "Your work brought us here. But from now on, only what we can prove together counts." Kulis nodded. He had expected nothing else. The ascent began early. The ground was still wet from the night dew. Bamboo rustled softly in the wind. The air was cool enough that breath became visible. Each step was placed, not taken. No one walked faster than the slowest. The loads were heavy. Besides personal equipment, they carried marking tape, sieves, measuring instruments, sample containers. Everything that was necessary to turn a place into a documented site. None of it was optional. When they reached the slope, perception changed. Not abruptly, but gradually. The wreckage field was smaller than expected, but denser. Aluminum parts lay scattered, partially swallowed by the ground. Plants had made their way through ribs. The mountain had begun to integrate the metal. The team leader had the terrain structured. Grids were laid out. Each area received an identification. Photos were taken before anything was moved. Notes followed. Everything happened calmly, almost quietly. Kula stepped back. He knew this place. But now he was not here to show. He was here to watch. In this withdrawal lay more than just physical distance. Kulis internally performed a handover. The place he had discovered no longer belonged to him. It had never belonged to him. It belonged to the dead. And now it belonged to those who had come to bring the dead home. His task was to be a witness, no longer the protagonist, but the quiet observer of a process that had to be carried out with care and respect. The first hours passed without special events. Metal was identified, cataloged, classified. Structural parts were separated from potentially relevant ones. Each step followed a fixed procedure. Then a team member knelt in one of the lower grids. He had noticed something that did not fit the pattern. His movements became slower, more careful. He looked to the team leader, who nodded. "We have human remains," the man said quietly. The sentence was not repeated. It did not need to be. No one reacted emotionally. That was not a lack of sympathy, but respect. Now only precision counted. What was not spoken in this moment was louder than any word could have been. Everyone on the team understood that they were no longer just recovering evidence. They were recovering people. Fragments of lives that had ended here 80 years ago. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was filled with an unspoken acknowledgement that these men had names, faces, families, who were still waiting. The only appropriate response was to continue the work. Not faster, but more carefully. Each movement became an act of respect. Gloves were changed. New containers prepared. Each step was documented. The ground was wet. Fragments had to be carefully exposed. It was not about quantity, but about attribution. Small parts, sometimes barely recognizable, but each of them could be decisive later. Between metal parts, personal effects were found. No complete objects. No things that immediately told stories. Rather, remnants. Fabric fragments. Parts of equipment. Things that someone had carried without attributing significance to them. A small, flat metal piece stood out. Worn, smooth at the edges. No technical component. Something that must have lain in a pocket. The team leader picked it up, looked at it briefly. "That's personal," he said. In these 3 words lay a whole world of recognition. He did not say, "That could be important," or, "We should catalog that." He said, "That belonged to someone. It had been part of a life, perhaps meaningless to others, but meaningful enough to the person who had carried it to have it with them." The team leader held it with a care that went beyond professional diligence. It was the gesture of a man who understood that he held a fragment of someone's existence in his hands. The slope remained dangerous. Several times someone slipped. One team member cut himself on a sharp edge. The injury was not severe, but it was immediately treated, documented. That too was part of the order. On the second day, the weather changed faster than expected. Clouds descended. The wind picked up. Voices were swallowed by the rushing. Fine snow set in. The team leader observed the sky for a long time, then spoke. We close this grid. Then we secure and withdraw. No one objected. Proximity to the goal was no argument against the mountain. This decision cost the team leader something. One did not see it in his face, which remained neutral. One saw it in the length of the pause before he spoke, in the way he looked at the sky once more, as if seeking a justification to stay longer. But he found none. The mountain dictated the conditions, not human will. And so, he made the decision that no one wanted to make the decision to return with incomplete work. It was the wisdom of a man who understood that greed, even well-intentioned greed, could be deadly. The work became more concentrated, but not hectic. Everyone knew that this window was possibly the only one. Nevertheless, no one accelerated at the cost of care. At the end of the third day, it was clear that a further stay would have become irresponsible. They had not recovered everything, but they had enough. The descent was harder than the ascent, not because of the load, but because of the responsibility. Each step was checked. The containers could not be damaged. Breath became shallow, hands numb. In the valley followed handovers, protocols, signatures. The containers changed stations, from field team to transport, from transport to laboratory. Each handover was part of a chain that at the end had to bear a name. In the laboratories began a different rhythm. Neon light instead of fog, air conditioning instead of wind. Fragments were cleaned, cataloged, analyzed. DNA samples were taken, compared. Weeks passed. Months. For Elizabeth Commons, this part was barely tangible. She was old, her body weak, but her memory clear when it came to Robert. A relative read her a letter. No dramatic words, only the state of things. Elizabeth listened. Then she only asked, "Was he alone?" "No," said the relative. "He was with his men." Elizabeth nodded slowly. This question contained everything Elizabeth needed to know. Not the details of his death, not whether he had suffered, but whether he, in his final moments, had had company. Whether the men for whom he was responsible had been with him, whether he had not died completely alone. The answer gave her something that looked like peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of a certainty she had not had for 80 years. A detail came to her mind. Robert had often carried something in his breast pocket before flights. A small piece of fabric from an old dress that she had once sewn. "You and your little securities," she had said. "You never know," he had answered. Whether this piece was ever found, no one knew. But the memory of it was there. For Elizabeth, this piece of fabric had been more than an object. It was a connection between them, something of her that he carried with him, as if her nearness were a talisman against what might come. She had teased him about it, but secretly, it had touched her. It showed that he thought of her, even when he was thousands of miles away, even when he was in danger. Whether the piece lay on the mountain, or had long been destroyed by weather, no longer mattered now. The memory itself was what survived. And in a way, that was enough. When the first results came from the laboratory, they were cautiously formulated. Matches, probabilities, no final sentences. But the direction was clear. On the slope, the wind continued to blow. The mountain took back what was not taken. But something had changed. Not the mountain, but the responsibility that had so long avoided it. At the end of this long path stood no moment that healed everything. There was no instant when one could say that now everything was right again. What returned came late, and what was missing remained missing. But something had nevertheless shifted quietly, irreversibly. When the remains of Robert M. King finally returned to the United States, the country was different from the one he had left. The cities had changed. The voices sounded different. The uniforms belonged to museums. But the name remained the same. And the place he had occupied had remained open all these years. For the family, the return was not a triumph. It was a correction. Something that had been missing too long found its way back, not to make up for the time, but to mark it. A grave is no replacement for a life, but it is a place, and a place is more than had existed for many decades. Elizabeth Commons did not experience this moment as closure in the usual sense. She had learned to live without closure. The waiting had shaped her life, influenced decisions, limited plans. When she received the news that Robert's remains had been identified, she did not react with grand words. She sat quietly. Her hands lay in her lap. She only said, "Then, he is no longer en route." It was a sentence without pathos, but it carried everything in it. The burial took place without publicity. No great protocol. No speeches. The flag was folded. Carefully. Routinely. Each movement was known. And yet it was new for this family. The name on the stone was clearly legible. No addition. No question mark. Only a beginning and an end. For many of those involved, the deployment ended here. Files were closed. Reports archived. Responsibilities continued to shift to other cases, other names, other places. The system functioned, late but correctly. What had not been possible for decades had now happened. For Clayton Coolidge, a different feeling remained. He had seen what persistence could accomplish and how much time it cost. The mountain on which the Liberator had lain had not become emptier. Metal remnants remained behind. The wind continued to move the bamboo stands. The place changed little, but responsibility had reached it, if late. Too late is not the same as in vain, Coolidge once said. It was not a justification sentence. It was a sober statement. The case of Robert M. King does not stand alone. Along the old routes of the Hump still lie wrecks, names that never returned. Families whose questions remained unanswered not because there were no answers, but because the path to them was considered unreasonable for too long. Each of these places carries its own story, and each of these stories waits not to be postponed any longer. What this case shows is not a failure of individual people. It is the effect of time, distance, and caution. But it also shows that responsibility does not expire. It can be postponed. It can be ignored. But it does not disappear. When the flag was smoothed over Robert M. King's grave, no one was tempted to say that now everything was good. No one spoke of redemption. It was not about comfort. It was about recognition. About a person who had disappeared in the service of his country, no longer remaining just a file number. At the edge of the cemetery stood someone who had never known him. A younger man who had read the name and stopped briefly. He did not ask who Robert had been. He did not ask what had happened. He simply stood there, a moment longer than necessary, and then walked on. Perhaps what remains is exactly that. A name that is no longer lost. A place that is no longer empty. And the quiet obligation that other names must not wait so long again. The wind continues to blow over mountains, over cemeteries, over places where history has been left lying. But sometimes it stops for a moment. Exactly where someone has finally arrived.